Casualties in the Russo-Ukrainian War included 6 deaths during the 2014 annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation, 14,214,400 civilians and military troops killed during the war in Donbas, and tens of thousands of deaths during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Background: Post-Soviet context and Orange Revolution. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine and Russia maintained close ties. In 1994, Ukraine agreed to accede to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a non-nuclear weapon state. Former Soviet nuclear weapons in Ukraine were removed and dismantled. In return, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States agreed to uphold the territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine through the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. In 1999, Russia was one of the signatories of the Charter for European Security, which reaffirmed the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose or change its security arrangements, including treaties of alliance, as they evolve. In the years after the dissolution of the USSR, several former Eastern Bloc countries joined NATO, partly in response to regional security threats involving Russia such as the 1993 Russian constitutional crisis, the war in Abkhazia and the First Chechen War. Russian leaders described this expansion as a violation of Western powers' informal assurances that NATO would not expand eastward. The 2004 Ukrainian presidential election was controversial. During the election campaign, opposition candidate Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned by TCDD dioxin. He later implicated Russian involvement. In November, Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych was declared the winner, despite allegations of vote rigging by election observers. During a 2-month period which became known as the Orange Revolution, large peaceful protests successfully challenged the outcome. After the Supreme Court of Ukraine annulled the initial result due to widespread electoral fraud, a second-round rerun was held, bringing to power Yushchenko as president and Yulia Tymoshenko as prime minister, and leaving Yanukovych in opposition. The Orange Revolution is often grouped together with other early 21st century protest movements, particularly within the former USSR, known as color revolutions. According to Anthony Cordesman, Russian military officers viewed such color revolutions as an attempt by the US and European states to destabilize neighboring countries and undermine Russia's national security. Russian President Vladimir Putin accused organizers of the 2011-2013 Russian protests of being former advisors to Yushchenko, and described the protests as an attempt to transfer the Orange Revolution to Russia. Rallies in favor of Putin during this period were called anti-Orange protests. At the 2008 Bucharest summit, Ukraine and Georgia sought to join NATO. The response among NATO members was divided. Western European countries opposed offering membership action plans in order to avoid antagonizing Russia, while US President George W. Bush pushed for their admission. NATO ultimately refused to offer Ukraine and Georgia maps, but also issued a statement agreeing that these countries will become members of NATO. Putin voiced strong opposition to Georgia and Ukraine's NATO membership bids. By January 2022, the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO remained remote. Euromaidan, Revolution of Dignity, and pro-Russian unrest. In 2009, Yanukovych announced his intent to again run for president in the 2010 Ukrainian presidential election, which he subsequently won. In November 2013, a wave of large, pro-European Union protests erupted in response to Yanukovych's sudden decision not to sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, instead choosing closer ties to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. The Ukrainian parliament had overwhelmingly approved of finalizing the agreement with the EU, and Russia had put pressure on Ukraine to reject it. Following months of protests as part of the Euromaidan movement, On February 21, 2014, Yanukovych and the leaders of the parliamentary opposition signed a settlement agreement that called for early elections. The following day, Yanukovych fled from the capital ahead of an impeachment vote that stripped him of his powers as president. On February 23, the parliament adopted a bill to repeal the 2012 law which gave Russian language an official status. The bill was not enacted. However, the proposal provoked negative reactions in the Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine, intensified by Russian media saying that the ethnic Russian population was in imminent danger. On February 27, an interim government was established and early presidential elections were scheduled. The following day, Yanukovych resurfaced in Russia and in a press conference declared that he remained the acting president of Ukraine, just as Russia was beginning its overt military campaign in Crimea. Leaders of Russian-speaking eastern regions of Ukraine declared continuing loyalty to Yanukovych, causing the 2014 pro-Russian unrest in Ukraine. Russian military bases in Crimea. At the onset of the conflict, Russia had roughly 12,000 military personnel in the Black Sea Fleet, in several locations in the Crimean Peninsula like Sevastopol, Kaka, Hvardeysk, Simferopol Rayon, Surik, and others. In 2005 a dispute broke out over control of the Surik Cape lighthouse near Yalta, and a number of other beacons. Russian presence was allowed by the basing and transit agreement with Ukraine. Under the agreements, the Russian military in Crimea was constrained to a maximum of 25,000 troops, required to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine, honor its legislation and to not interfere in the internal affairs of the country, and to show their military identification cards when crossing the international border. Early in the conflict, the agreement's sizable troop limit allowed Russia to significantly reinforce its military presence under the plausible guise of security concerns, deploy special forces and other required capabilities to conduct the operation in Crimea. According to the original treaty on the division of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet signed in 1997, Russia was allowed to have its military bases in Crimea until 2017, after which it would evacuate all military units including its portion of the Black Sea Fleet out of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and Sevastopol. On April 21, 2010, former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych signed a new deal known as the Kharkiv Pact, to resolve the 2009 Russia-Ukraine gas dispute. It extended the state to 2042 with an option to renew. Declaration of military operations. No formal declaration of war has been issued in the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian War. When the Kremlin announced the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, it claimed to commence a special military operation, sidestepping a formal declaration of war. The statement was, however, regarded as a declaration of war by the Ukrainian government and reported as such by many international news sources. While the Ukrainian parliament refers to Russia as a terrorist state in regards to its military actions in Ukraine, it has not issued a formal declaration of war on its behalf. History. 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea. On February 20, 2014, Russia began an annexation of Crimea. On 22 and February 23, Russian troops and special forces began moving into Crimea through Novorossiysk. On February 27, Russian forces without insignias began their advance into the Crimean Peninsula. They took strategic positions and captured the Crimean parliament, raising a Russian flag. Security checkpoints isolated the Crimean Peninsula from the rest of Ukraine and restricted movement within the territory. In the following days, Russian soldiers secured key airports and a communications center. Russian cyber attacks shut down websites associated with the Ukrainian government, news media, and social media. Cyber attacks also enabled Russian access to the mobile phones of Ukrainian officials and members of parliament, further disrupting communications. On March 1, the Russian legislature approved the use of armed forces, leading to an influx of Russian troops and military hardware into the peninsula. In the following days, all remaining Ukrainian military bases and installations were surrounded and besieged, including the southern naval base. After Russia formally annexed the peninsula on March 18, Ukrainian military bases and ships were stormed by Russian forces. On March 24, Ukraine ordered troops to withdraw. By March 30, all Ukrainian forces had left the peninsula. On April 15, the Ukrainian parliament declared Crimea a territory temporarily occupied by Russia. After the annexation, the Russian government increased its military presence in the region and made nuclear threats. Putin said that a Russian military task force would be established in Crimea. In November, NATO stated that it believed Russia was deploying nuclear-capable weapons to Crimea. 2014-2015 War in the Donbas. Pro-Russia unrest. Armed conflict. August 2014 Russian invasion. Mariupol offensive and first Minsk ceasefire. End of 2014 and Minsk II agreements. 2015-2022 frozen conflict. Between 2015 and 2022, the war settled into a stalemate, with few changes in territorial control. The conflict was marked by artillery duels, special forces operations, and trench warfare. Hostilities never ceased for a substantial period of time, but continued at a low level despite repeated attempts at ceasefire. In the months after the fall of Debaltseve, minor skirmishes continued along the line of contact, but no territorial changes occurred. Both sides began fortifying their position by building networks of trenches, bunkers and tunnels, turning the conflict into static trench warfare. The stalemate led to the war being labeled a frozen conflict. Despite this, the area remained a war zone, with dozens of soldiers and civilians killed each month. Between 2014 and 2022, the start of the conflict, there were 29 ceasefires, each intended to remain in force indefinitely. However, none of them stopped the violence. U.S. and international officials continued to report the active presence of Russian military in eastern Ukraine, including in the Debaltseve area. In 2015, Russian separatist forces were estimated to number around 36,000 troops, of whom 8,510,000 were Russian soldiers. Additionally, around 1,000 GRU troops were operating in the area. Another 2015 estimate held that Ukrainian forces outnumbered Russian forces 40,000 to 20,000. In 2017, on average one Ukrainian soldier died in combat every 3 days, with an estimated 6,000 Russian and 40,000 separatist troops in the region. Cases of killed and wounded Russian soldiers were discussed in local Russian media. Recruiting for Donbas was performed openly via veteran and paramilitary organizations. Vladimir Yefimov, leader of one such organization, explained how the process worked in the Ural area. The organization recruited mostly army veterans, but also policemen, firefighters etc. with military experience. The cost of equipping one volunteer was estimated at 350,000 rubles plus salary of 60,000 to 240,000 rubles per month. The volunteers were issued a document claiming that their participation was limited to offering humanitarian help to avoid Russian mercenary laws. Russia's anti-mercenary legislation defined a mercenary as someone who takes part with aims counter to the interests of the Russian Federation. The recruits received weapons only after arriving in the conflict zone. Often, Russian troops traveled disguised as Red Cross personnel. Igor Trunov, head of the Russian Red Cross in Moscow, condemned these convoys, saying they complicated humanitarian aid delivery. Russia refused to allow OSCE to expand its mission beyond 2 border crossings. August 2016 escalation. 2018 Kerch Strait incident. 2019-2020 2021-2022 Russian military buildup around Ukraine. From March to April 2021, Russia commenced a major military buildup near the border, followed by a second buildup between October 2021 to February 2022 in Russia and Belarus. Throughout, the Russian government repeatedly denied it had plans to attack Ukraine. In early December 2021, following Russian denials, the US released intelligence of Russian invasion plans, including satellite photographs showing Russian troops and equipment near the border. The intelligence reported a Russian list of key sites and individuals to be killed or neutralized. The US released multiple reports that accurately predicted the invasion plans. Russian accusations and demands. Prelude to full invasion. 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine began on the morning of February 24, when Putin announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Minutes later, missiles and airstrikes hit across Ukraine, including Kyiv, shortly followed by a large ground invasion along multiple fronts. Zelensky declared martial law and a general mobilization of all male Ukrainian citizens between 18 and 60, who were banned from leaving the country. Russian attacks were initially launched on a northern front from Belarus towards Kyiv, a northeastern front towards Kharkiv, a southern front from Crimea, and a southeastern front from Luhansk and Donetsk. In the northern front, amidst heavy losses and strong Ukrainian resistance surrounding Kyiv, Russia's advance stalled in March, and by April its troops retreated. On April 8, Russia placed its forces in southern and eastern Ukraine under the command of General Alexander Dvornikov, and some units withdrawn from the north were redeployed to the Donbas. On April 19, Russia launched a renewed attack across a 500 km long front extending from Kharkiv to Donetsk and Luhansk. By May 13, a Ukraine counter-offensive had driven back Russian forces near Kharkiv. By May 20, Mariupol fell to Russian troops following a prolonged siege of the Azovstal steel works. Russian forces continued to bomb both military and civilian targets far from the front line. Ukrainian forces launched counter-offensives in the south in August, and in the northeast in September. On September 30, Russia annexed 4 oblasts of Ukraine which it had partially conquered during the invasion. This annexation was generally unrecognized and condemned by the countries of the world. After Putin announced that he would begin conscription drawn from the 300,000 citizens with military training and potentially the pool of about 25 million Russians who could be eligible for conscription, one-way tickets out of the country nearly or completely sold out. The invasion was internationally condemned as a war of aggression. A United Nations General Assembly resolution demanded a full withdrawal of Russian forces. The International Court of Justice ordered Russia to suspend military operations and the Council of Europe expelled Russia. Many countries imposed new sanctions, which affected the economies of Russia and the world, and provided humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine. Human rights violations. The war has been accompanied by violations of human rights. From 2014 to 2021, there were more than 3,000 civilian casualties, with most occurring in 2014 and 2015. The right of movement was impeded for the inhabitants of the conflict zone. Arbitrary detention was practiced by both sides in the first years of the conflict. It decreased after 2016 in government-held areas, while in the separatist-held ones it continued. The investigation into the abuses, including torture, committed by both sides made little progress. According to Ochre, the closure of 3 TV channels amounted to a violation of the freedom of expression. There were cases of conflict-related sexual violence. However, Ochre believes that there are no grounds to believe that sexual violence has been used for strategic or tactical ends by government forces or the armed groups in the eastern regions of Ukraine. OKRA estimates that from 2014 to 2021 around 4,000 detainees were subjected to torture and ill treatment, approximately 1,500 by government actors and 2,500 by separatist armed groups, and reckons that around 340 of them were also victims of sexual violence. Related issues. Gas disputes. Until 2014, Ukraine was the main transit route for Russian natural gas sold to Europe, which earned Ukraine about $3 billion a year in transit fees, making it the country's most lucrative export service. Following Russia's launch of the Nord Stream pipeline, which bypasses Ukraine, gas transit volumes steadily decreased. Following the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War in February 2014, severe tensions extended to the gas sector. The subsequent outbreak of war in the Donbas region forced the suspension of a project to develop Ukraine's own shale gas reserves at the Yuzivska gas field, which had been planned as a way to reduce Ukrainian dependence on Russian gas imports. Eventually, the EU Commissioner for Energy Günther Oettinger was called in to broker a deal securing supplies to Ukraine and transit to the EU. An explosion damaged a Ukrainian portion of the Urengoy-Pomary-Uzhhorod pipeline in Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast in May 2014. Ukrainian officials blamed Russian terrorists. Another section of the pipeline exploded in the Poltava Oblast on June 17, 2014. One day after Russia limited the supply of gas to Ukrainian customers due to non-payment. Ukraine's Interior Minister Arsen Avakov said the following day that the explosion had been caused by a bomb. Russia planned to completely abandon gas supplies to Europe through Ukraine after 2018. Russia's state-owned energy giant Gazprom had already substantially reduced the volumes of gas transited across Ukraine, and expressed its intention to reduce the level further by means of transit diversification pipelines. Gazprom and Ukraine agreed to a 5-year deal on Russian gas transit to Europe at the end of 2019. In 2020, the Turkstream natural gas pipeline running from Russia to Turkey changed the regional gas flows in southeast Europe by diverting the transit through Ukraine and the Trans-Balkan pipeline system. In May 2021, the Biden administration waived Trump's Katsas sanctions on the company behind Russia's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline to Germany. Ukrainian President Zelensky said he was surprised and disappointed by Joe Biden's decision. In July 2021, the U.S. urged Ukraine not to criticize a forthcoming agreement with Germany over the pipeline. In July 2021, Biden and German Chancellor Angela Merkel concluded a deal that the U.S. might trigger sanctions if Russia used Nord Stream as a political weapon. The deal aimed to prevent Poland and Ukraine from being cut off from Russian gas supplies. Ukraine will get a $50 million loan for green technology until 2024, and Germany will set up a $1 billion fund to promote Ukraine's transition to green energy to compensate for the loss of the gas transit fees. The contract for transiting Russian gas through Ukraine will be prolonged until 2034, if the Russian government agrees. In August 2021, Zelensky warned that the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline between Russia and Germany was a dangerous weapon, not only for Ukraine but for the whole of Europe. In September 2021, Ukraine's Naftogaz CEO Yuri Vitrenko accused Russia of using natural gas as a geopolitical weapon. Vitrenko stated that a joint statement from the United States and Germany said that if the Kremlin used gas as a weapon, there would be an appropriate response. We are now waiting for the imposition of sanctions on a 100% subsidiary of Gazprom, the operator of Nord Stream 2. Hybrid warfare. The Russo-Ukrainian conflict has also included elements of hybrid warfare using non-traditional means. Cyber warfare has been used by Russia in operations including the Ukraine power grid hack in December 2015 and 2016, which was the first successful cyber attack on a power grid, and the mass hacker supply chain attack in June 2017, which the U.S. claimed was the largest known cyber attack. In retaliation, Ukrainian operations have included the Surkov leaks in October 2016, which released 2,337 emails in relation to Russian plans for seizing Crimea from Ukraine and fomenting separatist unrest in Donbas. The Russian information war against Ukraine has been another front of hybrid warfare waged by Russia. A Russian fifth column in Ukraine has also been claimed to exist among the Party of Regions, the Communist Party, the Progressive Socialist Party and the Russian Orthodox Church. Russian propaganda and disinformation campaigns. False stories have been used to provoke public outrage during the war. In April 2014, Russian news channels Russia 1 and NTV showed a man saying he was attacked by a fascist Ukrainian gang on one channel and on the other channel saying he was funding the training of right-wing anti-Russia radicals. A third segment portrayed the man as a neo-Nazi surgeon. In May 2014, Russia 1 aired a story about Ukrainian atrocities using footage of a 2012 Russian operation in North Caucasus. In the same month, the Russian news network Life presented a 2013 photograph of a wounded child in Syria as a victim of Ukrainian troops who had just retaken Donetsk International Airport. In June 2014, several Russian state news outlets reported that Ukraine was using white phosphorus using 2004 footage of white phosphorus being used by the United States in Iraq. In July 2014, Channel 1 Russia broadcast an interview with a woman who said that a 3-year-old boy who spoke Russian was crucified by Ukrainian nationalists in a fictitious square in Slovyansk that turned out to be false. In 2022, Russian state media told stories of genocide and mass graves full of ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. One set of graves outside Luhansk was dug when intense fighting in 2014 cut off the electricity in the local morgue. Amnesty International investigated 2014 Russian claims of mass graves filled with hundreds of bodies and instead found isolated incidents of extrajudicial executions by both sides. The Russian censorship apparatus Roskomnadzor ordered the country's media to employ information only from Russian state sources or face fines and blocks, and ordered media and schools to describe the war as a special military operation. On March 4, 2022, Putin signed into law a bill introducing prison sentences of up to 15 years for those who publish fake news about the Russian military and its operations, leading to some media outlets to stop reporting on Ukraine. Russia's opposition politician Alexei Navalny said the monstrosity of lies in the Russian state media is unimaginable. And, unfortunately, so is its persuasiveness for those who have no access to alternative information. He tweeted that warmongers among Russian state media personalities should be treated as war criminals. From the editors-in-chief to the talk show hosts to the news editors, should be sanctioned now and tried someday. Putin and Russian media have described the government of Ukraine as being led by neo-Nazis persecuting ethnic Russians who are in need of protection by Russia, despite Ukraine's President Zelensky being Jewish. According to journalist Natalia Antonova, Russia's present-day war of aggression is refashioned by propaganda into a direct continuation of the legacy of the millions of Russian soldiers who died to stop Nazi Germany in World War II. Ukraine's rejection of the adoption of Russia-initiated General Assembly resolutions on combating the glorification of Nazism, the latest iteration of which is General Assembly Resolution A/C.3/76/L.57/Revelation 1 on combating glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism and other practices that contribute to fueling contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, serve to present Ukraine as a pro-Nazi state, and indeed likely forms the basis for Russia's claims, with the only other state rejecting the adoption of the resolution being the U.S. The deputy U.S. representative for ECOSOC describes such resolutions as thinly veiled attempts to legitimize Russian disinformation campaigns denigrating neighboring nations and promoting the distorted Soviet narrative of much of contemporary European history. using the cynical guise of halting Nazi glorification. NAFO, a loose cadre of online shitposters vowing to fight Russian disinformation, generally identified by cartoon Shiba Inu dogs in social media, gained notoriety after June 2022, in the wake of a Twitter quarrel with Russian diplomat Mikhail Ulyanov. Russian-NATO relations. Russian military aircraft flying over the Baltic and Black Seas often do not indicate their position or communicate with air traffic controllers, thus posing a potential risk to civilian airliners. NATO aircraft scrambled many times in late April 2022 in order to track and intercept these aircraft near Alliance airspace. The Russian aircraft intercepted never entered NATO airspace, and the interceptions were conducted in a safe and routine manner. Although Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has characterized the conflict as a proxy war instigated by NATO, he said, "We don't think we're at war with NATO. Unfortunately, NATO believes it is at war with Russia." British Prime Minister Boris Johnson rejected Lavrov's allegation that NATO is fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. Former CIA Director Leon Panetta told the ABC that the US is without question involved in a proxy war with Russia. International reactions. Reactions to the Russian annexation of Crimea. Ukrainian response. NATO and United States military response. Financial markets. Reactions to the Russian intervention in the Donbas. Ukrainian public opinion. Russian public opinion. Reactions to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian public opinion. Russian public opinion. United States. See also